All right, so we've just gone over some really awesome stuff so far. We've looked at the big four. We've looked at some screenwriting, script to screen examples. Hopefully, you looked at some more of those examples. And so now, what I want to do is I want to cover some formatting nuance. Okay, so what do I mean by formatting nuance? So this is all the little stuff that is extra compared to the big four, right? So if you remember, the big four is all you need to know in order to get started with your script and start writing. Okay, so this formatting nuance that I'm referring to really has to do with those small things that you may or may not need for your particular script, right? It just depends on your story, how you want to tell it. Okay, so I'm going to introduce some of these pieces just so you know, so it's in your toolbox and you can refer back to this later as things come up. You don't necessarily need to memorize it right out the gate, but if you can, that's great. But for now, I just want you to be aware of it and introduced to it so that you know where to look when those questions come up again. Okay? All right. So, the first thing I want to introduce us to is this idea of subheaders. Okay. So, we first talked about headers with scene headers, right? So, the opening of our scenes, the location, the space, and the time of day, right? So, now with subheaders, this is just a way to streamline your script, right? It's helpful, but it's not entirely necessary. It does make things cleaner and a nicer, smoother read, but if you just kept using the scene header formatting that we just went over in the big four, you would be totally fine and totally correct. Subheaders are just if you wanted to streamline and keep things super tight, okay? So subheaders are really used if we're in the same space, general space, right? But a more particular or precise space within it. Okay. So it can show a change in immediate location without the interior or exterior in the same major space changing. So the house, right? So a bedroom or a bathroom or a living room or a kitchen in the same house could be used as subheaders instead. So we're not just saying house, bathroom, house, living room, house, kitchen, right? You could just show kitchen, bedroom, bedroom, bathroom, living room, right? So we can just keep that really short, sweet, and simple. Okay. What's also important to note is that it can also show a passage of time in the same space. So if we haven't even left that bedroom, but it's several hours later, then we can use later as its own individual subheader, meaning it's on a line all by itself, later in all caps, and then we go into the next line of new scene action. Okay, so these are just different examples of how you can use subheaders. So um, refer back to that first video where we did the overview because it gives a really great examples of subheaders. It used Ratatouille as an example to show a subheader in time. So how we show a different time in the same space. It was a nice dissolve to. We saw later happen, and we still see him working on the cookbook. And then we also saw a Toy Story example of using a subheader to show a different location. So now he's on the dresser. Woody moved to the dresser. Okay. So it got more precise. All right. So ways to make your headers briefer, but the key thing is to remember that they are subheaders. So they are subordinate to a major header, right? So don't just use them willy-nilly and get sloppy and just shortchange your subheaders and make them bad headers, right? They need to work with a major header to begin with, okay? So don't just randomly go to a brand new location and forget your other major elements, okay? All right. Transitions and camera angles. Okay, so this is important. Notice how these were not in the big four. And this is mostly because we don't want them in our writer script. Okay, for the most part, what we're doing here in this class is talking about a screenwriter screenplay. Okay, not a production script, not a shooting script, not a director script. Okay? There's a big difference. Okay, so we don't put the camera angles on, the director does. Now, if you're saying, well, I want to direct my movie, that's great, do it later. Okay, for now, I just want you to focus on the story. Okay, focus on the story, focus on your characters, on your dialogue, on those pieces first. Okay, so we want to avoid transitions, which are the cut tos or dissolve to or match cut to. We want to avoid that. We want to avoid camera angles like, close up on, wide angle shot, you know, dolly in. We want to avoid these camera angles and movements as well, because those are very much the director's tools and director's language. Okay, so we're avoiding them unless absolutely necessary, right? These are spec scripts, which you're writing, not shooting scripts, okay? But there is a fun trick that you can do with your scripts, okay? That can still give you that little control, what little control we as writers have to tell the story in the way that gives the visual essence of what we're going for without having to do transitions or camera angles. And this is this idea of paragraphing, okay? So pause for a second. Recall back to when we talked about scene action. And I said that your scene action should only be paragraphs 3 to 4 lines long, right? So how do we decide which 3 to 4 lines we use, right? And it could be shorter, it could be like 1 line, 2 lines, but 3 or 4 lines. You really don't want to go more than 4 lines, okay? But how do I decide if I make my paragraph 1 line, 2 lines, 3 lines, or 4 lines long? At what point do I make that paragraph break? Okay, when do I decide that now's the time for a new paragraph? Okay? And what you can do is you can decide by implication, by implying what your camera angles or movements or transitions are. Okay? So you can imply what you want your audience to see, okay, by how you paragraph things, right? So if you say, you know, uh, a bead of sweat drips down his forehead and into his eye. He squints as it stings him. Okay? What do you see when I say that? Do you see this close up of a character's face, an extreme close up as we see a bead of sweat drip into someone's eye? Right? So I'm implying this close up shot, right? Versus, you know, stadium lights fill thousands of seats empty, right? Stadium lights fill thousands of seats empty, right? So, or empty seats, however, right? Stadium lights fill thousands of empty seats. Okay, so now we're seeing scope, right? Thousands of empty seats. That's a lot of space. So we're probably at an extreme wide shot or maybe even an aerial shot, right? So we are implying what we're looking at and how we're looking at it by the words that we're using. That is our tool, that is our weapon as writers, is the words and how we use them, okay? And so how I would break that up, for instance, like I would break up my paragraph with just about my extreme close-up of my character sweating, probably just played an intense game of football, right? Or baseball or whatever a stadium means, right? And then we can move our audience's head out further to show the stadium and its empty seats, right? So I would start a new paragraph there. Okay, so that's this idea of paragraphing, implying camera movements, camera angles, wherever you want your audience's attention to turn, turning their head here, turning their head there, focusing their eyes here. That's how you can break up your paragraphs, okay? Use your words to direct your reader's eye and break the paragraphs up that way, okay? Takes time, takes practice, takes getting used to, but rule of thumb, you want to keep those paragraphs short. You want to avoid camera angles and transitions, okay? Title cards. Okay, so this is something that some folks like to use. You don't have to use them, but it's nice to know what to call them. Right. In the first video we saw, The creator referred to it as chirons, right? I've never heard that word used before except for in that video. Okay. I've only ever heard super or tidal, and tidal was the other word that he referred to it as. Okay. So for our purposes, I'm going to say super or tidal, but it's basically used to denote text being shown on the screen, right? And I don't want to just say like it's a subtitle because it's not. I mean, subtitles, yes, sometimes we're using subtitles, but typically in reference to dialogue. Um, Title cards or superimposed text, superimpositions, are the text on screen. So like whenever we see like changes in location or time, like big time, or we're doing setting setup, like in a galaxy far, far away, right? And all the Star Wars movies where we change planets or like Tatooine, right? um, or just time frames. Go look at Black Panther, right? If you've seen Black Panther, they use title cards a lot. We say like Wakanda, right? Nairobi, right? Um, America, whatever, right? Oakland, 1984, 1994, whatever, right? So text on screen. How you denote that is simple. You just put super or title in all caps with a colon and then whatever text you want to appear on screen. Okay. So pretty basic, but super or title with a colon and then whatever text you want to appear on screen. Pretty simple, pretty basic. Use it sparingly. Don't get carried away with it, but it can be really useful. All right. Next formatting nuance is going to be intercutting. Okay, so these are for my folks who want to use like phone calls in their scripts. Okay, so if you want to show people having conversations and the scene cuts back and forth, which we typically see with phone calls, this is called intercutting, right? And this I grabbed straight from the Get Out script to demonstrate what this looks like. The key thing to note with intercutting is just this is a transition. I know I just said, Becca, you just said don't use the transitions. This is one of those examples, one of those exceptions to the rule because it's really not a transition for like style's sake. Like it's not a dissolve or a cut, but it is very much a story element. Okay. And so, what's important is that we need to set up our locations. We need to set up the two places or multiple places that we're cutting back and forth between and who's talking in them, right? Who's sitting in them, sitting in those spaces. And it's really pretty simple. All you need to do is put intercut with colon in all caps right before the second location that you're intercutting with. Okay. And you'll see sometimes, and it's not super rigid. It can show up on the left side margin here, like this is shown, or it can show up on the right hand side where typical transitions are housed. The thing is, you just want to be clear and consistent. Intercut with. Super simple. But notice how we have exterior airport departures terminal day. Rod Williams, 26, African American, a stocky TSA agent, smokes a cigarette and hides it from arriving passengers. His cell phone rings. Sup. Intercut with interior Rose's car day. Chris sits in the passenger seat and talks on the cell phone. Hey, you at work? Okay, so now we're about to see on the next pages, we're going to see them go back and forth, and we're not going to be cutting back and forth to like exterior airport, interior Rose's car. We've set those scenes, right? So now we're just going to cut back and forth between the dialogue that they're speaking and the actions that they're taking. Because we know where they are now. We know what the context of their locations are. So now we're just cutting back and forth. Okay, so pretty easy. All you need is that intercut with right before a certain location. And they forgot the I. Awkward. But there you go, intercut with. All right, and so the next thing I want to reference is introducing characters. So the first time we see characters, and what's really neat is we just saw this in our last example, right? We just saw this in our
If we
last
take novel
example,
writing,
and this is starting
so
too soon. We saw this in our last example with Rod, the TSA agent. Okay, and we're going to reference it again. But first, let's kind of run through what I'm talking about, this idea of introducing characters, okay? So, whenever we see a character first appear in a script, their names are going to be all caps, okay? Then every time after, it's normal sentence case, just the first letters capitalized like a normal name, right? But the first time we see them, it's going to be all caps because we want to denote, hey, casting people, costume people, actors, this is the first time you're showing up. It's a big deal. This is important. Okay. That's why it's all caps. Okay. What's interesting is screenwriting is this nice combo of what playwriting and fiction writing is like. So in fiction, their name is just like a normal name the entire time. In playwriting, it's in all caps the entire play. So screenwriting is a little bit of both. It's that first time we see them, it's in all caps, but every time after, it's regular case, okay? When we first introduce a character, it's important that we give an age or an age range so that the casting director, the casting folks, they know exactly who they should be looking for, right? But what's important for us as readers of scripts is to know kind of in our brain who we're looking at. So don't just assume that your audience is going to know how old your character is because we have no context for the story. It's been living in your head for months now, but a new reader is not going to have any idea that your main character is in their early 20s unless you tell us your main character is in their early 20s. Okay? Otherwise, we could be guessing. They could be in their teens, they could be in their 30s, right? So you want to make sure you tell us their age range. Okay? Other thing to note, only supply physical descriptors if it's relevant to the story. Okay, so a lot of times it's not necessary to tell us what clothes they're wearing or how their hair looks. Okay, this is a common fallback for new writers is to describe how they look. Okay, it's not important. It's actually pretty flexible. Casting might find someone who looks totally different than how you imagined your own character, but matches the essence. Okay, so when you describe your character in the first time you're introducing them, give their essence. So, like, who are they? If I pass them on the street, what do I notice about them? What's my first impression of your character if I don't know who they are and I'm just passing them by? Okay. The key is to keep it brief. Okay. So let's go back real quick. I want to look at this example with Rod. So notice how Rod Williams is in all caps. Okay. His name is in all caps because this is the first time we're seeing him. And we have his age, 26. African American, excuse me, African American. Super important. His race is very important in the context of the story, right? Race is very important in the context of the story, but in general, okay? He's a stocky TSA agent, smokes a cigarette, and hides it from arriving passengers. His cell phone rings. Okay, so we are learning a lot about Rod here in just his introduction, right? So we got his age, we got his race. He's stocky TSA agent. He's also a sneaky TSA agent. He's doing stuff he's not really supposed to be doing. He's smoking and he's hiding it from arriving passengers, right? He's kind of like not taking his job too seriously. So we kind of get a sense of who he is, right? So those are things to think about when introducing your character. So let's take a look at this short video clip real quick and we'll learn more about introducing characters.
If we take novel writing, so we're going to be spending a lot of detail on setting a world, but if we are doing a screenplay, are we really, how much are we really paying attention to like the setting of it, the scenes? Because won't some of that be fleshed out when the actual film starts and the director storyboards or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is important to pay attention to the where of your story, right? Because every choice that you make in your screenplay should be a deliberate one. So if you've chosen a setting, there should have been some reasoning behind that. You're not going to set your love story about, working with incarcerated writers. You're not going to set that in a juvenile detention center. Maybe.
No.
You want it to be in a very specific sort of like type of prison to inform that world, right? So I think that you should pay attention to the where. If we're talking about the the process of actually conveying that on the page, I think that the trick of screenwriting, right, is to be as concise as possible, but as evocative as possible in those few words. So that's the trick of conveying it on the page is being deliberate about your choice, and then conveying it as specifically as possible so that you can get as much out of your choice as you can. Does that make sense?
It does. So fade in, if we're talking about, let's say, this library, this hypothetical, fade in. That's where I'm having. How much detail
Okay.
am I using?
Yeah, well, so early in your screenplay, you probably, because you're just introducing us to the world of your story, you'll probably take a little bit more time to convey where we are, the feel and the tone of where we are, and maybe the important characteristics of that setting, right? And then as your script progresses, you'll probably need to describe less, both because we've probably already seen a lot of these locations, and then also because you want your story to move fast, right? So as you go further along in the screenplay, you'll probably spend less time establishing locations than you did at the very beginning when you were trying to establish the world and create that world in our minds so that we could live in it for the duration of your story. Now that said, I think that there's also value though in knowing which moments in your screenplay should breathe, and when you have a moment that you need to sort of give space to, that might be when you bring us into the world for a little bit, longer of a moment with some extra detail or telling us what's going on in that scene or something like that. Does that make sense?
It does,
Okay.
yeah. Is that the same for when we're doing a character description in the beginning? Like if we use this hypothetical librarian, she's 35, straight blonde hair, maybe a little bit dark under the eyes from staying up all night reading. Or something. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, so there's a lot of emphasis put on those character introductions, right? I think I have two minds about this. I think that people get caught up in writing like the perfect character introduction. I think that they are important because the first time we meet your character, you want to give us a sense of who they are, sort of concisely and evocatively, right? But I've seen some character introductions that are a little too long, that maybe like stop the story in order to give us a lot of information about the character the moment we meet them, which can be, if you're reading a script, it can really pull you out if you are forced to stop the scene and meet this person. That feels like it interrupts the flow of the story, right? So I think that the trick of writing character introductions, again, is the same with all screenwriting, which is be as concise as you can, but as evocative as you can. And what you're trying to convey when you introduce the character is give us that sort of like defining quality about them, that essence of the character that's going to be important to the story. So physical descriptions might not be as useful to us, right? Because the blonde hair might never come into play in the story, right? But it might be useful to know that she's overworked or that she's burning the midnight oil, or, that might be important to the story and the situation that she finds herself in. So stuff like that could be useful. And you just have to sort of determine like, what's the most sort of defining quality about this character that I need my reader to understand right now as I introduce them.
Awesome. So that's introducing characters in a nutshell. Something to think about with yours. Who are your characters? What is their core essence when you first introduce them and you're introducing their name in all caps, right? All right, so I have two more slides to go over with this formatting nuance. They're super brief. This first one is just with dialogue. This is a small formatting nuance, but it's so important because it comes up a lot with our scripts and our dialogue. It's this difference between interrupting versus trailing off. So when a character gets interrupted, you don't even have to say character gets interrupted or anything like that. You can just use a double hyphen, so a dash dash, double dash. So like, what the f? Language, right? Someone can just, you can use that double dash to cut off a word mid word and interrupt with another line of dialogue from a different character. Like imagine a child saying this, like, what the, and then someone's like, language, right? So they don't even get to finish the word. And so you don't even have to say interrupts or denote that this person's interrupting because just the double dash clarifies that. Okay. Um, on the flip side, if someone is trailing off, whether it's ominously or uncertainly, you know, I don't know what to do. Or like, I wonder if, and they just trail off. And, they're unsure of themselves or just kind of lost in their thoughts, which happens sometimes, right? You can just do an ellipses, which is the three periods, right? Dot, 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 right? So what do you think we should do? You think we should, what do you do, right? Like that kind of trailing off, that pause, that waiting, that lingering moment. Okay. So there's big difference. And sometimes it's whether unconsciously or, unknowingly, writers switch those sometimes and think an interruption is a dot, 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 and dash is a trailing off. But now you've heard it. Now you know. Interruptions come with the double dash, and the trailing off comes with the ellipses. Okay. And last but certainly not least is the parentheticals. Okay. So notice these weren't in the big four. So parentheticals are these things that kind of show how the dialogue is delivered, right? How an actor says something. So um, with these, we want to use them sparingly because we don't want to over direct our actors. I don't even typically mention them ever because I don't want y'all to use them if you can avoid it. Okay, because sometimes they become a crutch. Sometimes we get too uh, wrapped up in them and think we need to express everything every which way instead of using our story, using our subtext to convey that meaning. Okay, so use sparingly. So, like once every 5 pages or something like that, right? That's spare. Okay. And really only use it when action or dialogue intention is not obvious. Okay, a lot of times it is obvious that my character is being sarcastic. A lot of times it is obvious that they're mad or yelling, right? Use an exclamation point. That's a quick way to show that someone's yelling. Use all caps to show someone's yelling without having to put in parentheticals that yelling, they yell, whatever. Um, but when you do use them, if you do use them, make sure it's only at the beginning or in the middle of dialogue and never, never, ever, ever at the end of dialogue. Okay. And also note that it's always in lowercase with no pronouns or complete sentences. So do not write a complete sentence that says he glances at her in the parenthetical, but instead do something like glancing at her or glances at her, right? So these are just like very fine minutia. So if you're worried about getting this wrong, just don't do it and you'll save yourself the trouble. Okay, so just some things about parentheticals, but that is the last thing that I will talk about for formatting nuance. There is plenty more. There's a whole book about formatting for screenplays that you can purchase and review if you would like, if you really care about it. But also Google is a beautiful thing. So, and also, I have a guide from Shore Scripts up on the canvas. So if you would like to review that, it goes into more detail. But this is a great starting point. So if you know that you're going to be using some of these things in your scripts, go for it. But some of these you might not even use in your story because your story doesn't need it. And that is okay. Okay. But now you know some more formatting nuance. Stay tuned and we're going to go over a little bit more. But this is script formatting in a nutshell.